October 1944. A small village near Épinal, France. A young French woman stands outside a brick schoolhouse, watching American military trucks roll past through the mud. She holds a dismissal letter in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly against the cold paper. Inside the local headquarters, a white American commander strikes a name from a supply manifest, cutting the town's winter fuel rations in half, because a local civilian refused his demands. A black American corporal sits locked inside a dark holding cell at the edge of the base, confined under guard for a crime that exists in no military handbook. A line has been crossed in the French mud, and an entire town is about to freeze to force two people apart. But a letter is already traveling up the chain of command, ensuring Patton will deliver a reckoning that strips the abuser of his unearned authority. This is the story of what happened when an American officer threatened to freeze a liberated French town just to destroy an interracial romance. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when silence becomes complicity. Corporal David Collins was 24 years old, from Chicago, Illinois, and served with the 391st Quartermaster Battalion. He had grown up on the South Side, working in a brickyard before the draft board called his name in the winter of 1942. He had seen the segregation of the training camps in Mississippi, and he had survived the high seas terror of the Atlantic crossings on a crowded Liberty ship. In Normandy, he had hauled fuel cans through the hedgerows under mortar fire, losing his closest friend to a German sniper outside St. Lo. He was a quiet man who carried a heavy wrench in his back pocket and a worn Bible in his field jacket. His unit arrived near Épinal to rebuild the local infrastructure, which brought him directly into the path of a local civilian who needed help clearing the ruins of her life. Major Virgil Stanton was 41 years old and served as the area military liaison from Evansville, Indiana. He wore a tailored wool uniform that never saw the inside of a trench, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine by an enlisted orderly. He believed firmly that the American military had a social hierarchy to maintain, frequently stating to his staff that interracial relationships endangered discipline and morale across the entire European theater. He kept a small black leather notebook in his breast pocket, where he recorded the names of local women seen talking to black drivers. He used his authority over the local supply lines as a personal weapon, cutting off flour or coal to households that did not comply with his unspoken rules. He viewed the liberated French population not as allies to be respected, but as subjects to be policed under his own strict code of domestic order. By October 1944, the Allied advance across France had stretched the military supply lines to their absolute breaking point. The Third Army was burning millions of gallons of gasoline every single week as it pushed toward the German border. In the wake of the fast-moving front, hundreds of small French villages were left in a state of administrative limbo. The local populations had no coal, very little food, and relied entirely on the American military government for their daily survival. Civil affairs officers and area liaisons held immense, unchecked power over these communities, controlling the distribution of basic necessities with the stroke of a pen. In many sectors, senior officers chose to look the other way when their subordinates used this logistical leverage to enforce personal prejudices. The official military policy segregated black soldiers from white soldiers, but it had no jurisdiction over the private choices of French civilians who had just been liberated from 4 years of Nazi occupation. Many area commanders simply ignored the overreach of local liaisons who attempted to police the social lives of the villagers, viewing it as a minor administrative detail beneath their notice. This lack of oversight allowed deep-seated biases to dictate who received fuel and who went cold in the autumn mud. The system was designed to fight a war, but in the hands of the wrong man, it became a tool to enforce a private social order. The village schoolhouse near Épinal remained cold as the autumn wind rattled the loose window panes, its wood boxes completely empty. The children sat at their desks with their wool coats buttoned tightly to their chins, while the local mayor argued with the authorities inside the makeshift American headquarters. Captain Thomas Miller entered the wood-paneled office, holding the weekly logistics manifest for the Épinal sector. Major Stanton sat behind his desk, using a small silver knife to trim his fingernails over a clean blotter. Miller placed the report on the desk and stood at attention, his eyes fixed on the empty fuel allocation row for the village schoolhouse. The local schoolteacher was removed from her classroom this morning. "Major," Miller said. Stanton did not look up from his nails. "She was removed because she lacked the proper appreciation for military discipline," he answered. "The villagers are refusing to clear the timber for the secondary supply road until her position is restored," Miller said. "They state she has broken no law, and neither has Corporal Collins." Stanton dropped the silver knife onto the desk with a sharp metallic click. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his polished boots. "Laws are for courtroom lawyers back in Washington, Captain. Out here, we are maintaining the social order of the United States Army. I will not have my sector corrupted by an integrated romance that degrades the authority of every white officer in this command. Our orders from 3rd Army are to stabilize the civilian population to keep the roads open," Miller said. "The fuel cuts will freeze the children in that schoolhouse by Tuesday. Then the townspeople can teach their children a lesson about obedience," Stanton said. "If that woman wants her classroom back, and if she wants coal for her neighbors, she will stop walking down the public square with a Negro truck driver. The corporal is confined to quarters under your direct signature for conduct unbecoming," Miller said. "There is no specification listed in the logbook." "The specification is that he forgot his place in this army," Stanton replied. "I have already handled 3 other women in this valley who thought they could ignore our standards. A minor reduction in their flour allowance corrected their behavior within a week. This schoolteacher will learn the same lesson, or her village will spend the winter in the dark." Miller stepped back, his face completely pale. "That is a direct violation of civil affairs regulations regarding the treatment of liberated populations," he said. "I am the regulations in this sector, Captain," Stanton said. "You will file that manifest exactly as it is written, or I will find an assistant who understands how to follow a command." Miller picked up his cap from the desk and turned toward the door without saluting. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up to the curb outside the sector headquarters, the engine idling with a low growl in the damp air. 4 silver stars gleamed on his polished helmet, and the ivory handles of his revolvers rested against his hips. The clerks and orderlies in the outer office went entirely rigid as the general walked in unannounced, his boots striking the floorboards like rifle shots. He did not look at them. He pushed open the door to the inner office without knocking. His eyes locked on the officer behind the desk. Major Stanton stood up instantly, his hand snapping to his brow in a stiff salute. "General," he said. Patton studied him for a long moment, his face completely expressionless. "What regulation did the French civilian in this sector violate, Major?" he asked. "None, General," Stanton answered. "She is a local civilian." "What regulation did the corporal violate?" Patton asked. Stanton cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. "He violated the standards of good order and military discipline, General. His behavior with a local woman was creating a serious disturbance among the men in this sector." "Good order," Patton repeated. "Yes, General," Stanton said, his voice gaining confidence. "I have used my authority to maintain necessary social barriers. It is a matter of protecting the morale of our white troops and ensuring proper discipline in an occupied zone." Patton stepped closer to the desk, his voice dropping to a cold, level tone that carried through the open doorway into the outer room. "You are an area liaison, Major, not a parish priest or a domestic judge. Your authority extends to the movement of supplies, the clearance of roads, and the security of our rear echelons. It does not extend to the personal lives of the people we just liberated from 4 years of foreign oppression." "The civilian population must respect our leadership," Stanton said. "The French people do not owe you their obedience in their private choices," Patton said. "They spent 48 months under the boots of men who tried to control who they loved, who they taught, and how they lived. We did not cross the Atlantic Ocean to replace a German tyranny with an American one. Corporal Collins has spent the last 5 months hauling ammunition through the mud while you sat in this office trimming your fingernails. He has earned the right to walk down any street in this country without being hunted by his own commander. You have taken fuel meant for freezing children and used it as blackmail to satisfy your own personal prejudices. That is not military discipline. That is cowardice. You have a choice, Major. You will personally restore the fuel manifest for that schoolhouse, or you will face a general court-martial for the unauthorized diversion of military supplies. Decide, now. Stanton looked at the general, his mouth opening slightly as the color drained from his face, before he silently reached for his pen. Captain Miller stepped forward with the rewritten supply manifest, placing it directly over the old blotter where Major Stanton had signed his name. Two heavily armed military policemen, their white helmets gleaming under the dim office bulbs, stepped into the room from the corridor. They did not look at Stanton. They stood behind his chair, their leather holsters unsnapped, waiting for the general's nod. Stanton picked up his pen, his fingers shaking so violently that the steel nib scratched deep into the paper as he crossed out the penalty orders. He restored the school's name to the top of the heating list and initialed the full release for Corporal Collins. The local mayor and Mademoiselle Marchand stood outside the frosted glass door, watching the immediate reversal of the decree that had threatened to freeze their children. The order was stamped, finalized, and logged into the Third Army record book before the ink could even dry. Within minutes, the heavy wooden gates of the compound swung open to allow a convoy of olive-drab supply trucks to pass through the mud toward the village square. The local townspeople stood along the ditches, watching the fuel drums roll back into the schoolyard as the two military policemen escorted Stanton toward a waiting transport vehicle bound for the rear. Corporal David Collins returned to Chicago after the war, marrying a woman from his neighborhood in 1947 and working as a master mechanic for the city transit system until his retirement. He rarely spoke about his time in France, but he kept a small, hand-carved wooden schoolhouse on his workbench until the day he died in 1991. Mademoiselle Elodie Marchand remained in her village near Épinal, teaching 3 generations of local children in the very classroom that had been saved from the winter freeze. She never married, and whenever visitors asked about the silver whistle she wore around her neck, she simply told them it was a reminder that some lines must never be crossed. Major Virgil Stanton faced an immediate administrative reassignment to a remote supply depot in Iceland, where he spent the remainder of the war managing coal manifests under freezing skies. He left the military in 1946 and returned to Evansville, Indiana, where he lived a quiet, bitter life as a bank clerk until his passing in 1974. He never spoke to his family about his time in Europe, and his name was completely omitted from the local veterans registry. General Patton never included the Épinal incident in his public memoirs or his official reports to the War Department. He kept a single copy of the altered fuel manifest in his private desk drawer, accompanied by a brief handwritten note that remained hidden until his papers were unsealed decades later. The note simply stated that an army that fights for liberty cannot allow its own officers to practice the very tyranny they were sent to destroy. Some historians have argued that Patton's intervention in this local matter was primarily driven by a desire to keep the French civil population cooperative and prevent rear echelon labor strikes from disrupting his forward logistical momentum. They claim that his harsh treatment of the area liaison was calculated to send an immediate message to other commanders about the necessity of maintaining operational order above all personal beliefs. Others have argued the opposite, suggesting that the general possessed a deeply ingrained sense of traditional military honor that refused to tolerate the abuse of civilian authority or the exploitation of tactical logistics for private malice. What is certain is that the official supply records for the Épinal sector still show the immediate restoration of the village's fuel quota on that afternoon. If you had been in General Patton's position, would you have taken the same decisive action to protect the local civilians, or would you have handled the situation quietly through standard bureaucratic channels to preserve the internal military chain of command? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories about what happens when silence becomes complicity, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now.